Welcome everyone. It looks like people are getting connected to the audio, so we're going to go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to thank you for joining us for our webinar on multilingualism and equity in the Pacific region. My name is Kirsten Miller. I am a communications manager at REL Pacific, and I'll be one of your facilitators today. I'm joined by my colleagues Deborah Van Zyl, Bradley Rentz, and Aaron D'Amelio, and together we'll do our best to manage the technology and the conversation. So as people continue to join and we get started, I'm going to address a couple of housekeeping issues, as you'll see on the next slide. At this point, I think we're all really familiar with Zoom, but we're asking everyone to stay muted to avoid background noise and any feedback. You can use the chat feature to ask questions, which we'll address during the question and answer session. And when you post in the chat, we do ask that you send to all panelists and attendees, which will allow others to see your questions and comments, and we can have a more interactive conversation. Closed captions are also available from the toolbar should you need those. And if you have any technical questions, please do reach out to Deborah in the chat. So on the next slide, you'll see that we are recording this session. We will share the recording and the slides with you along with a survey. So look for a couple of follow-up emails from us. And since we only have an hour together today, I'm going to take just a moment to tell you a bit about the REL program and about REL Pacific, in case you're not yet familiar with us. REL Pacific is one of 10 regional educational laboratories, or RELs, that are funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. So on this slide, you can see the map illustrates all 10 of those regions. And on the next slide, we'll provide just a little bit of information about the REL Pacific region. So REL Pacific serves educators in the state of Hawaii, in 3 U.S. territories, American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, and 3 independent nations in free association with the U.S. Those are the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, which includes Foshui, Pohnpei, Chuuk, and Biak, and the Republic of Palau. And within these jurisdictions, we work with a number of research practice partnerships, which focus on several distinct priority areas. And those are college and career readiness and success, educator professional learning, language and literacy, which is our topic today, developing language skills and literacy goals in multilingual contexts, and then social and emotional learning and data use and readiness, which kind of underpins all of those other priority areas. And finally, before I hand this over to my colleagues, I'd like to introduce our guest presenters today, Dr. Christina Higgins and Professor Delina Amos. So Dr. Higgins is a professor in the Department of Second Language Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She's a sociolinguist who studies multilingualism and designs research that is meant to lead to positive changes in society. Her research examines multilingual practices and identities with attention to the ways that marginalized populations use their languages as a resource in different social domains. And as part of this work, she conducted a multi-year professional development project with K-12 educators on Oahu, which also led to a co-authored book with Ava Ponte about serving multilingual language learners in the classroom. And in addition to teaching courses for the Department of Second Language Studies at the university, Dr. Higgins is a co-director of the Charlene Junko Sato Center for Pidgin, Creole, and Dialect Studies, which works to document, describe, and advocate for better understandings of Hawaii Creole, which is known more commonly as Pidgin. And Dr. Higgins is also editor-in-chief of Applied Linguistics. So we are very pleased to have her with us today. I'd also like to welcome Professor Delina Amos, who is a professor and the chairperson of the Social Science Division at the College of Micronesia, FSM. Her areas of special interest are developmental, cognitive, and social psychology. And her teaching experience in Micronesian cultural studies, the history of Micronesia, and contemporary issues in Micronesia courses has developed her passion in women's leadership, arts and identity, pre-colonial history, and the impact of change on the Micronesian family. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Higgins and Professor Amos with us today. As you can see, we have a lot of information to cover. We have a lot of expertise to tap, but we have left time for questions and conversations. And we're really looking forward to hearing about your experiences and your contexts so that we can learn from each other. So with that, I will hand this over to my colleague, Erin, to go over today's agenda and to launch our conversation.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, and hello, everybody. So we're going to cover, as Kirsten just mentioned, quite a few topics, so I'll be brief. We're going to start off with defining educational equity, just so that we are all entering this conversation with a shared understanding, at least for this webinar, about what educational equity is. And then we'll go through some examples and definitions of what it means to be multilingual, and seeing that diversity of multilingual education experiences shared in the Pacific region. We'll have a little bit of a discussion on multilingualism and equity, and then of course have a Q&A summary and then wrap up for today. So I'm going to start off with an explanation of, or at least a definition of, educational equity. And we're going to use the following two definitions in our session today. One comes from the Center for Public Education, and another one comes from the National Equity Project. So you can read those on your screen, but essentially for the first definition, equity being achieved when all students receive the resources they need so that they graduate prepared for success after high school. And from the National Equity Project, equity means ensuring equally high outcomes for all participants in our education system, removing the predictability of success or failures that currently correlate with any social or cultural factor. Now, we provide those knowing full well that these two definitions of equity kind of cover the nuance and complexity of this topic, and of course warrant further exploration and definitions, especially when we think about outcomes. Like, what does that mean? We don't want it to just be academic outcomes, but those skills and capacities to thrive in life. But for the purposes of this webinar, we'll move forward with these two definitions just to orient ourselves, because we all might be coming in with different perceptions and definitions of what equity is. And as we'll see in this webinar, a student's language skills are part of equity concerns, because perceptions, supports, and expectations for language use in the classroom can sometimes or oftentimes enable or prevent educational success. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Higgins to begin our session on what it means to be multilingual.
All right. Aloha kako. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm glad to be invited to talk about multilingualism and multilingual pedagogies with you. I've been living in Hawaii on the island of Oahu for the past 16 years. So many of the ideas that I will talk about today have been informed by my experiences here. So thinking about multilingualism, we are all multilingual in a sense, in that what this means is everyone has a linguistic repertoire or a set of communicative abilities comprised of many different linguistic resources that they use to create meaning. So we all have the ability to produce and or understand different varieties of a language, such as even how Generation Z talks these days and texts, compared to perhaps how our parents might do the same thing quite differently. For those of us who've learned to speak a language like Japanese, we are aware of formal and casual forms with grammatical repercussions. We all have an accent, whether it is stigmatized or not, and we can understand a large range of different accents in our different languages, especially if we try. And then we use different registers when engaged in our professions compared to when we're speaking with our family members or playing sports. And then we all have different knowledge of different genres, the conventions of speaking, for example, when doing a job interview compared to how to have dinner party conversation. And sometimes you can feel like you're at a job interview when you're really at a dinner party because the genre is wrong. So in this way, we all have these various capacities to begin with, even if we only speak one language. Moving along, though, to other views of multilingualism. So these are some vehicle-themed illustrations. Most people think of bilingualism as an ideal ability to use two languages perfectly to talk about any topic in the form of balanced bilingualism, which is in the middle here. So here, languages are symbolized as different wheels that operate without touching each other, without interacting with each other, keeping the rider equally balanced, always available at all times. However, this is rare since people tend to use different languages for different social purposes and different amounts of those languages, even in a single interaction. The two wheels are not always present, or they are present in differing sizes even. And then we have subtractive bilingualism on the left, which can occur when people grow up speaking a language other than the majority or school language and are required to or feel compelled to avoid using that language when entering school and other institutions. So this often results in language shift and language loss. This is what happens when a two-wheeled bike becomes a unicycle, and that's really hard if you've learned to ride a two-wheeled bike to try out a unicycle. On the other hand, we have translanguaging on the right, this all-terrain vehicle, which is an attempt to symbolize a more realistic view of multilingualism. And each wheel is separate on its own sort of suspension system and is a resource that can be used when needed, but can be more in the background, more in the foreground, depending on what the work is that's involved. Another important concept in multilingualism is diglossia. And this is the idea that a language is only used and should only be used in specific sociolinguistic domains, and that it's inappropriate or also sort of not done to speak those languages outside of those domains. This can be found in societies or communities with strong beliefs about languages and their place. Sociolinguistic domains are, different contexts like we see here, in which languages are used, and people might have a strong feeling that you should use one kind of language per domain, such as in the home or at workplace or in education. So there might be views that one language is best for each domain and another is inappropriate. So this diglossic view of multilingualism can happen in education, and it can create barriers for multilingual individuals. And it really stands in contrast to descriptive research on how multilingual people actually use their languages, crossing domains all the time. So in contrast to diglossic views, then, translanguaging provides a more integrated, more dynamic approach that empowers people to use their entire linguistic repertoires in spite of domain boundaries. It aims to capture the fluid, dynamic nature of multilingualism. And then rather than having a language be off limits, all languages are available and can be used as needed to get the job done. In terms of illustrating what this can look like, we see translanguaging in written form all the time in signage around us. So these examples here illustrate this. On the left, we see an ad by Telecom Vanuatu promoting mobile services with refill here, which is a kind of a middle ground between Bislama and English. And it works well to target speakers of both languages, as well as people with some knowledge of either. And similarly in Hawaii, we have these cards, these stamp cards from L&L Barbecue featuring English and Hawaii Creole or Pidgin. So here we see a stamp card explaining everything in English. The 12th plate is free or on the house. So here Pidgin is marked through the pronunciation change and the spelling. This tiny amount of Pidgin is very important though. It's a marker of localness and generosity. So now that we understand translanguaging a little more, we can turn more to education. Broadly speaking, research on all forms of multilingual education has demonstrated equitable outcomes for multilingual students. When students' languages are included in schooling, rather than being seen as off limits or in a diglossic way inappropriate, the results have largely shown that students are more likely to experience academic growth and academic success, as well as a feeling of inclusion and belonging. So I'll be illustrating some of these pedagogies next. All right. So here's a list of strategies in the literature, some of which I have been involved in, of how to use instruction that supports students' languages and encourages interaction with peers, which is a crucial component of especially K through 12 settings. So specifically here, we might talk about think, pair, share. In large group settings, here students would turn and talk to each other in any and all languages available to them before participating in the large group sharing. Because students will be able to rehearse their idea with a partner, they can practice and feel more confident and comfortable vocally participating. And they will be also able to practice more than one set of language skills. We also have another set of options here: talking chips, timed activities, hot seat, and reader's theater. A lot of these are targeted for younger audiences, elementary education, but not limited to that. So here, students use any of their languages to participate in group activities. In talking chips, students might support each other through shared languages and group discussion. In timed activities, students could work collaboratively in more than one language to take turns. In the hot seat, emergent bilinguals are given the opportunity to lead class or be asked questions by a group. And in reader's theater, students work together using any of their languages to represent a scene or a concept in the form of a tableau, like a frozen scene on a stage. Multilingual pedagogies involving translanguaging encourage the use of students' home languages, even when the goal is to produce final work in the language of school. So this can also include using students' languages in the process leading up to final work. And in many cases, there's room for having bilingual outcomes where the final work is produced in school language and home language with creative possibilities here. And I'll just point you, for the sake of time, to the City University New York resources, of which there are many, many concrete examples of translanguaging pedagogies, which show how students' languages have a role in their learning. And they don't require teachers to know all of the students' languages. So this is a frequent concern and question, but all the work that students do in group work, in brainstorming, in researching, in investigating, these are places where home language, community languages certainly can play a role. All right. Moving along to more specific examples that I've had a hand in, looking especially here in Hawaii. Just wanted to give you a little glimpse, demographic glimpse for people unfamiliar. So we do have, about 17% of our students designated as English language learners. It really depends where you are, what school you're in, how the numbers play out. Schools I've done work in have had 30+% English language designated learners. So it can vary drastically. But our top 5 most spoken languages are Ilocano, Chuukese, Marshallese, Tagalog, and Spanish. I want to talk a little bit about some examples from this Malihini project that I was engaged in. It was a multi-year project to help train teachers to support multilingual children in elementary schools. And the project aimed to move teachers from subtractive bilingualism to more multilingual pedagogies, to invite them to try them with our support over the period of more than 1 year. We also encouraged more learning about students' cultures and identities alongside this more multilingual pedagogy orientation. Some examples of what we did include these 3. So these are in schools where children speak many different languages, 5+ languages in the home per classroom, but the main language of schooling is English. So first, for example, was an icebreaker on the left, meant for the first weeks of school, where students and teachers were asked to share about their linguistic repertoires by writing them on a star-shaped badge that they would wear on their shirt, and then circulate, talk to each other, learn about each other. This deepens everyone's understandings of students' multilingual repertoires and also encourages some pride, perhaps, in home languages. And it can lead to difficult conversations, like what does it mean to know another language? Second is the activity of a language and culture box. So early in the school year, students were asked to illustrate their languages and cultures in a 3-dimensional box with drawings, maps, and other features to express who they are. This is a good chance for teachers to learn about students. A common finding in the United States is that teachers don't know what languages their English learner designated children speak. They don't know their home country affiliations, or they don't have that demographic knowledge. So this is an opportunity to address that. And then third is an example of bilingual writing, which one of our teachers, a kindergarten teacher, ventured to try out after getting encouragement from us. One of her students was an emerging bilingual with Japanese and English. Since second language literacies build more effectively on solid first language literacies, she wanted to try to see how that worked by inviting her student to practice bilingual writing. And the results were so impressive to her that she continued the work well after our professional development stopped. The other students also became very interested in Japanese, so it created a multilingual enthusiasm in the classroom, and it also encouraged the students' parent to come to the classroom and connect to the community and bring that into the school. Another multilingual pedagogy we helped to implement is students as language experts. So this is, in this example, in a kindergarten classroom again, we have a teacher, T, and Fatima, F, talking about numbers in Portuguese. So here we see Fatima, who speaks Portuguese and English, teaching her classmates numbers 1 through 10. This is not meant to create fluent bilinguals in Portuguese and English, but to encourage a translanguaging space in the classroom. So the teacher encourages metalinguistic translanguaging by drawing attention to the ways that Portuguese can sound like English, as in the number 3, which is pronounced something like trish in Portuguese and sounding like English fish. The student takes up this lesson when they learn number 4, quatu, which they spontaneously relate to the English word quack, quack, which has something to do with their lesson as well. So the teacher used this in teaching math. The classroom had a small plastic pool that the teacher had prepared filled with water and some rubber ducks with tally marks on the bottom. And the children were asked to fish out a duck and practice addition. So here we see the teacher in the transcript reminding the students how to say 3 in Portuguese. And then she praises one of them, Godfrey, for recalling the right pronunciation. And then another student takes a turn to catch a duck. His duck has 4 tally marks on it. And the teacher asks all the students to remember how to say 4 in Portuguese. They remember quack, quack in English, and the ducks help, I'm sure, which triggers quatu, which Fatima confirms, and the class continues with their math lesson. My final example will focus on a less planned out form of translanguaging, which we call laissez-faire translanguaging. It's what can occur in many educational contexts when there is no specific policy or no explicit sort of support even for multilingualism. Rather, teachers and students draw on their home languages to support discussion and learning, and we want to look at how this is beneficial. So in this case, in Hawaii, 9th graders and their teacher in a high school English class are discussing Sherman Alexi's novel Flight, and they're using Ilocano and English to do so. So we see a student named Kix struggling to explain about a metaphor in the story that uses the terms drowners and lifeguards to refer to people who either help you or burden you in life. The other students don't quite follow, and the teacher asks him to explain in a different way, which leads him to begin in English, but then move into Ilocano to talk about emotions and lifeguards as being metaphorical in one's life. The teacher then restates his explanation helpfully in relation to the novel while translanguaging, which makes the point that even characters in books can be lifeguards for people in distress. And this leads the students who weren't previously on the same page to show their deeper understanding of the novel. All right, so with those examples, I'm done with my segment of the presentation, and I look forward to discussing these ideas further after we hear from Delina. Thank you.
Great. So yes, we're going to turn to Delina now. So Delina, I see you've unmuted yourself and off to your section of the presentation.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for having me. Thank you for a very detailed presentation, Dr. Higgins. So when I saw your draft, I decided to make it very general, but the details would be on what is multilingualism and some of the approaches that we've taken. And then finally, recommendations to what we can do in terms of using the culturally relevant approaches in the Federated States of Micronesia. All right. Okay, first I would like to provide some background to the language uses in Micronesia. And based on our history, there's approximately 20 indigenous languages within the Micronesian region. Let me be clear to say that when I refer to the Micronesian region, I'm referring to the eastern, all the way from west, excuse me, from Yap, Palau, all the way to Kiribati. But much of what I will be covering today will be mostly about the Federated States of Micronesia, including from the west, Yap, which is Yap, Chuk, Pohnpei, and then Koshai. Okay. The islands, based on our history, the islands were colonized by several powerful countries, first beginning with Spain, Germany, Japan, and then the United States. So as a result of these colonial experiences, the languages, especially in how people communicated with one another, were affected by these colonial histories and experiences. After the colonial impact, the islands gained independence, and this is referring to the Federated States of Micronesia, in which, as a result of this transition to independence, an agreement between the Federated States of Micronesia, or what became the Federated States of Micronesia, which include, once again, Yap, Chuk, Pohnpei, and Koshai. The compact affected not only language, but the movement of people, where much of the population started to freely migrate to not just to Guam, Saipan, and Hawaii, but today a larger population is now migrating to US mainland. Okay. So because of the migration or the movement of people, language continues to be affected by what we experience today as globalization. And the influence is now mainly on language use, not only within the Micronesian region, but also within the Federated States of Micronesia. All right. So the effects of colonization on multilingualism in Micronesia. And I'd also like to make an emphasis that much of what I will be also sharing today are the results of studies that I've done in my own classroom with several courses, especially in the Micronesian Studies program, and previous workshops that I've co-shared with the Pacific Island Studies program through UH Manoa. With these experiences, we've worked with teachers in Guam, and these were groups that came from elementary schools based in Guam, and also in the Central Northern Mariana School, who also attended this workshop. And much of the data will be based on that workshop and also a prior workshop that we held in putting together an ebook for undergraduate students regarding Pacific Island studies. So prior to putting together this book, there was a survey conducted by the Pacific Island Studies Program to also collect concerns on what students found to be challenges in how they read textbooks that were published and then sent to not only Micronesian schools, but also to students as English, with English language as the secondary language. Right. So the effects of colonization on multilingualism. Schools and language learning were designed to deliberate local traditions and values in order to change the indigenous language to better reflected foreign values or better needs of the foreign power. Okay, I wanted to share this piece because the initial thought was when English was introduced to the island nations today, or to the islands, the initial intention, or so most believe, was to teach islanders on how they can self-sustain or find ways that by learning language, they can find ways to cope or to learn to be independent, especially in realizing that now they're going to be interacting with not just islanders within the Micronesian region, but foreigners coming from first Spain, Japan, and then the United States. But later on, it became very evident that the introduction of foreign languages were now to help, or then help the colonial power to reflect the foreign power and values. So as these foreign values and power became more dominant than the indigenous values, it became also evident that people were not only losing the native language, but it also changed their perception of how they see their own values and how they see their own language. And a classic example is how people began to think that the languages in Micronesia were less superior than what was introduced to their islands, may it be Japanese language or may it be the American language. Not only did it affect how they communicated non-verbally in terms of how they expressed their practices and values, it also affected the spoken language to where English became more dominant and it became more valued. And later on, we will see how this affected the language in terms of the introduction of the many policies that were introduced to the Micronesian region. So these changes, these effects led to the increasing loss of traditions, traditional knowledge, as well as, which later affected the decrease in knowledge of the indigenous language and culture. So as we can see, as a result of these changes, several policies, we can see the transition in the changes and the policies during the missionaries' times, which started in 1850s. The policies were English for commercial purposes and some Pohnpeian reading for the development of the first Bible that was introduced to the islands. And this was implemented in the 1970s and still being modified to the present time. During the Japanese period, Japanese language was introduced to the Micronesian schools. The Kokaku and the Shokaku were the two systems that were introduced during that time. But Japanese language became the main language in the local schools. And this was during the 1920s to the later 1940s. And then during the Navy time, although local languages were used, English remain the dominant language or the universal language within the Micronesian region, starting in later 1940s or mid 1940s to the present time. During the Navy period, under the US Department of Interior, another policy was mandating that local languages be used from early childhood system schools to 4th grade, then beginning 5th grade to 8th grade, transitioning to English. And this was the elementary school. All right, so then again, under US Department of Education, we noticed that English became the only language in our school systems. And this was from 1961 to early 1970s. And then again, the policy switched back to where local languages must be taught beginning early childhood through 4th grade, then transitioning back to English. And then after the islands, the Federated States of Micronesia became an independent nation, the system remained the same. This was in 1986 to now. The system that we know now as the existing language policy is that all schools within the FSM are mandated to teach in the local language from early childhood to 4th grade. Then English is then taught, or teaching uses English in the classrooms from 5th grade and on. Okay, now I'm going to look at indigenous languages to how multilingual approaches can be used in our classrooms. And once again, this is based on what I've done in my own classroom, as well as what I've done with other researchers and other teachers across the Pacific region. And this is especially through the Pacific Island Studies program. And I'd like to add, there was one thing that I neglect to include, but some of the experiences that I would also like to share are experience that I've also gained by working with the REL program, not only here on Pohnpei, but the office based in Hawaii as well. So when I share about my experiences on storytelling, these will be experiences that I've also gained as a result of working with the REL office. Okay. All right. The first approach that I would like to cover is the problem-based learning approach. Can we look at the slide that lists the bullets on problem-based? Thank you, Brad. All right. So what is the problem-based learning approach? I'll talk about the problem-based learning approach first, and then I'll touch on the place-based learning. All right. And I have to apologize that I didn't add any visuals on this, but if anyone has any questions on these approaches later on, I will send you the cases that I've used in my classroom, the specific examples. All right, problem-based learning approach. At least based on what I've used for several semesters now, when I explain to my students what is a problem-based learning approach, the general tips that I give them is, given that the concept is problem-based, this is where we create our own case scenarios depending on what concept or what theory is being taught. And when I talk about this, I'm referring to the college level teaching, but this can be modified to fit our elementary school classroom settings. So when we create a problem-based approach, this is creating a case scenario that has to be ill-mannered, meaning that it has to have a problem within that case scenario. So usually when our students see textbooks that are being used in our classrooms, A common scenario that we see is that because these textbooks are introduced from our Western societies, case scenarios often use Western culture problems. So within this context, when we create these problems, they have to be local problems. They have to be problems within our homes where students can easily relate to these problems. So aside from creating these problems that fit the Micronesian context, one of the things that should also be included in our problem-based learning case scenarios we should also consider the names of the people who are involved. For instance, a local name would be Delina or Rita. So these are things that we need to consider. Problem-based learning scenarios that are within the Micronesian context, and also using names that are Micronesian or local names. And this is an approach where it helps students to not only memorize content, but it helps them to also think beyond the concepts that are taught. It teaches that there is no one correct answer, but there are several approaches to solving a problem. And the reason why I encourage this in my classroom is that it also opens up an opportunity for students to think critically about the concepts that are introduced to them in a classroom. Right. And then there's the place-based learning approach. Okay. And this is used a lot, especially in our elementary level classrooms. And this is where the indigenous education, the common practice, indigenous education in Micronesia that was used prior to the colonial experience. And it encourages problem-solving skills that are directly tied to place-based learning. Okay. And this is an approach where students not only learn in our classrooms, but for instance, when we talk about history, we take them to specific sites where they can see for themselves, experience for themselves what they're learning from the textbook or what they're learning from their teachers. And an example is a few years ago, we had a storytelling project in collaboration with the REL office, where as students learn about their histories, their oral histories. For instance, when they learn about Nanmadol, they're not just learning about Nanmadol by reading the textbook or looking at pictures of Nanmadol, but the teachers actually go on site along with their students to see, to observe for themselves, and to also write stories. Okay. So it doesn't mean that they're only writing one portion of what they know about Nanmadol, but they get to learn from the elders around Pohnpei to learn about the place and the history behind the construction of Nanmadol. All right. And then place-based learning, when it comes to learning about important skills, again, they don't read about these skills from a textbook, but they actually learn from elders on how these skills can be learned and how they are very valuable to the local culture. And these involve learning from elders, visiting natural sites like Nanmadol or other ruins in Nech, Sokes, the initial construction of the Nanmadol sites. And then as these skills and local knowledges are being taught, they're taught in the indigenous language, where children can learn about the skills that are needed for them to survive. And this is these are some of the examples of place-based learning.
Well, Delina, if I could interrupt you just for a moment, we have a question in the chat from Christina, actually, about how widespread it is for K-12 students to be exposed to Indigenous and local ecological knowledge approaches. Can you share, is it only done in a few places? And how might teachers get exposure to these ideas?
Okay, from my experience right now, it also depends on the subject being taught. Like here at the college, I can say that the marine science program uses this. So depending on what is taught in the courses in the program, I know their students are exposed. We also have a Micronesian studies program, to which I'm also a coordinator to that program. Much of our courses also require exposure. So it actually depends on the program and what is being taught to our students. There's actually no limitation. It depends on what their, I would say, the student learning outcomes are for each of those programs. Did I answer that question, Christina?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow. I'm wondering, like, maybe also teachers of younger students, how they get, if they're going to be like math and science teachers, would they be exposed to these ideas?
I would hope so. I know that, several years ago when I attended the Micronesian MTech conference, there were several workshops that also introduced opportunities for teachers to be exposed to. All right, so the storytelling approach. All right, so this is where students not only learn through hearing stories, but they would be encouraged to tell their stories using local languages. And I know this is done in our Pohnpeian classrooms. As we went through the language policies, we've seen that the local language is mandated from early childhood to 4th grade. So in especially our basic level elementary school, storytelling, an example is how they learn about their oral histories through either Pohnpeian, Chukis, Koshayan, or Yapese. And as they learn about their stories and when they're given chances to also tell their stories, stories become an important way to share Indigenous knowledge in Micronesia. Through these books, which is written, I'm going to use Pohnpei as an example, students where stories embed local language knowledge, children can learn about ecological knowledge, practices, cultural practices and values, as well as metaphors about their identity and belonging to either their ethnic identity or their racial identity. Through this same process, children learn important societal information such as norms, values, where language is conveyed through knowledge that are passed down through legends and other practices, especially medical practices. Okay. But I also made a note that in Micronesia, it is also a cultural value as part of wow or respect that not everyone can tell certain stories, nor when it comes to medicinal practices, certain practices involving medicinal uses, not every Micronesian can pass on the knowledge. Not everyone can also receive that knowledge. And that's another sacred norm that people who teach about storytelling or would like to teach that have to be mindful of, because not every story can be passed on. These are very sacred, sacred practices. All right. And I think that's another question that learners and teachers should also consider. And that's a question that we can also discuss later down the road. Like, one question is does this become a barrier to how we teach our students? And finally, all of this type of learning was done in indigenous languages, and the child could learn to thrive on the island, especially by learning about their values and norms through storytelling. Okay, so what are some of the approaches when we use culturally relevant approaches? In a culturally relevant classroom, or when we use a culturally relevant approach, we have to be mindful of the context. Indigenous knowledge is often highly contextualized. For example, knowledge can only be shared depending on the subject or the nature of what is being shared. Certain knowledge can only be shared within one's clan or to a specific clan, or is tied to place, time of the year, or the purpose to which the knowledge is being shared. Education settings should be mindful of the contextualized information, such as who, when, and how it can be shared. And this is what I was referring to a while ago, that certain things can be shared depending on the type of medicinal purpose or the type of local medicine being used, and where it's being used and what it's being used for. Okay. And then finally, indigenous learning is also tied to a student's well-being, and for which it's meant to help the student thrive physically, socially, and mentally in their community. Finally, although these approaches have been used, there are challenges to whether or not they have obtained success in helping our students to achieve student learning outcomes. And I'm sorry, I keep referring to student learning outcomes, and I guess I'm also big on assessment, and that's why I keep talking about learning outcomes. But based on what I've done, especially in terms of language and assessing success in my classroom, there are several recommendations that I would like to share today that can help teachers start changing practices in their classroom. And one of them is creating dedicated times and activities for using languages. How can we use this? Teachers can be encouraged to apply the problem-based learning approach or the place-based learning approach. I know some of our teachers are using this, but if this becomes a widespread practice, this can also address multilingual approaches and challenges in our classrooms, to where English remains the dominant language in our classrooms. Another recommendation can be not penalizing students for using local languages in our classroom. One reality that we have in our classrooms today, and this is especially in our private schools, is that when students use local language, they're punished for using the local language in their classrooms, English, because English is the preferred language, especially in our private schools. Third is creating class projects that can help students reconnect to their communities by learning about traditional knowledge and local ecological knowledge. And this can be realized by using a place-based approach in our classroom. Okay. And again, we can also encourage discussing the importance of indigenous practices in today's world through topics like climate change and environmental sustainability. And then finally, we can create learning spaces where students' entire well-being is supported. And again, this can also be used in our not only place-based learning approach, but also the problem-based learning approach, to where students learn that there's not only one correct answer, but there can be several approaches to solving a problem. That was the last of my presentation, and I would be happy to respond to any questions that anyone has for me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Delina and Christina, for those wonderful presentations. So now we'll move into the question and answer period, since we only have a little bit of time left. So if you have a question for anyone, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or you can ask in the chat and we can do that as well.
Hi, Brad. I noticed that you were cited in a lot of what was just presented. Is there any way you can share that publication with us? I would love to read it, your 2018 manuscript.
Sure. It's in the references in the slides, and so that is publicly available. There's a link to it. So.
Thank you.
And we'll send out the slides again and the recording as soon as that's available. Once we've gotten that closed captioned and online. And as we're taking questions, we'd also love it if you could complete our feedback survey. I've just put that link in the chat as well. It's only 5 questions. It shouldn't take more than really a minute or two. We just love to hear what you thought about our time together today, any suggestions for future events. There's an open-ended question section to talk about what you liked about our time together today, and anything that we could improve. So we do encourage you to please take a few minutes to fill that out.
Any last questions that we could answer?
Yeah, I see that Jen has unmuted herself, so I don't know if she wants to ask her question or not. So Jen, would you like to?
I feel like it's a very T.S. Eliot moment, like to roll the question into a ball and, put it out there. But, when we're looking for opportunities to present our teachers in the Department of Education with high quality professional development that will transform their pedagogy and improve outcomes for all of our students, it's a real challenge to present these excellent strategies if the teachers are not necessarily from the same places that our students are from and lack understanding, and we don't have a strong connection to the communities themselves to ask how to represent their cultures and languages best as a department. And I don't know that we should be making all of those decisions, but we want to be mindful of how that representation should present itself to teachers, especially teachers who are new to Hawaii.
Yeah, I mean, I've given talks to Teach for America groups, which is interesting because you can just assume they know very little. And yet they're very open to being informed, usually. I don't know what to suggest except to have schools, figure out who they're serving and to identify the needs of getting to know their communities, and then to start from there. I think there's a lot of variation in schools with regard to how representative the teachers are of the students. In our experiences in the Malihini project, the teachers volunteered to participate in the PD, and the ones we had, were very open and also tended to be multilingual people themselves. And that was fascinating to us. The most multilingual people were the most willing to try multilingual pedagogies. The least were the most resistant. And they tended to not be from Hawaii. And that's what we saw, So I think there's a lot to unpack and address. And it's certainly, you can't just say, here's a bunch of multilingual pedagogies, go. You have to know you have to get to know the students that you're serving. Teachers know that, I think, and the communities, the parents, the histories of the place. So yeah, it's a bigger issue than just here's a bunch of tried and true pedagogies.
Yeah, I appreciated hearing about the professional development that you did and look forward to and learning more about it. And I know there's a lot of really passionate experts in this webinar, and I encourage you, if you are interested in offering professional development on any of the topics that were addressed today to our teachers, I'll drop my email into the chat, and if you want, we can talk about what that looks like and how we can start to build more connections. We do encourage our teachers to look into opportunities at the institutions of higher learning. This summer, we had many teachers take advantage of courses at HPU, UH Manoa, Kapilani Community College. So we're trying to build that connection between, because I noticed someone said that pipeline of teachers from here to being in the classroom. So thank you for this excellent webinar.
I see that we had some other questions in the chat that I'd love to return to. Delina, did you want to respond to that original question about teachers maybe not being familiar with from the place and having to engage in place-based education? I know that there are some different teacher populations in Micronesia as well, that there may be a difference between the cultures of the teachers and the cultures of their students. So would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I would like to respond to that. When we had our first storytelling project, actually, we didn't come up with that project, but it was REL office, thanks to, I see there in this webinar, thanks to Canida and Juanita, mother and daughter. They were the ones who came to us for the storytelling project. I'm speaking for myself. This was something that I've never used in my classroom. So when we did that storytelling project, it finally dawned on me that this was something that I had to use in my classroom. So we also had the same challenge in, how we would get our students to the places that we want them to see for themselves. And it didn't involve all teachers. Thanks to REL office, Canida and Juanita, they worked with traditional leaders and other education leaders to help set up, to speak with the landowners, because in Micronesia, we also have to consider the fact that some of these sites, we have to cross private land to, for example, get to Nanmatol. So there are certain fines, there are certain permission, certain people that we have to speak to get to Nanmatol. So even in Pohnpei, we have the same problem. We have to think about how to get to those places. So, the reality is we have to create a relationship with people outside of our classroom or the school system to set up these place-based learning projects. I hope I answered that. So whether you're someone who's been living in a place for a long time or not, I think the experience would be the same for someone who's just arrived to, for example, Hawaii. You have to really establish a connection with other folks around the island.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes, thank you, Paulina.
Yeah, and this is Paulina. I work with REL, living in Pohnpei, but I'm from Chuk. For place-based learning, like Kani put it in the chat box that there's REL has been involved with a lot of development of place-based information and professional development. And I know, like at the Micronesian Teachers Education Conferences, you see a lot of these taking place too. where teachers are introduced to place-based learning or approaches. And I know both the colleges, College of Micronesia and CCPI in Chuk, they're very key on that. So they're really focusing on connecting learning in the classroom with home or what students are exposed to in the community.
Do we have any other questions from the group? If anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask. And just as a reminder, I know that there have been quite a few questions coming into the chat, and we are grateful that many of you have stayed on for today's presentation. So we do have all of these questions, and we may not get to every single one, but we will collect them later and try to respond to them. We'll definitely be sharing out this recording for sure. And I think maybe we'll possibly end with this final question that Monica just posted. And I think in some ways it kind of ties into some earlier questions too about that tension between the standards that teachers need to teach to and are tested on, and then some of the strategies that you both, Christina and Delina, have shared. There sounds like there's not only a need, but there is also a desire for teachers to incorporate these kinds of strategies into their classrooms, but oftentimes it gets, the focus is on, well, I need to teach this standard and it's not explicit in my curriculum, and so I'll just go with what I know, or that kind of perspective. So do either of you have any thoughts about that tension? And even though teachers may not be explicitly told to translanguage, but that they could still incorporate not only translanguaging theory or practices into their classroom, as well as having place-based and other culturally relevant strategies. And obviously we've talked about the importance of building relationships with the students to enable that. But Christina and Delina, do you have thoughts about that tension between wanting to do that, maybe not having enough information, but also that the standards that they need to teach to?
I'll just throw in that the notion of translanguaging gets at border crossing more broadly and could include like trans curriculum for, I mean, I just made that up, but this idea of, the standard knowledge that we're aiming for, what is that, right? If it's doing algebra, okay, or if it's doing analysis of Western canonical literature, all right. But the notion of trans is, you can incorporate local languages, cultural practices, norms. You can re-examine norms, but also the knowledge itself. And instead of sort of keeping to the canon, I suppose to imagine ways that, let's say, Hawaiian forms of doing science could be brought into the standardized science curriculum. And that would be in itself transformative and translingual and trans everything. So trying to make space, and it's not going to obstruct learning. It's not going to prevent the learning of the objectives, the learning objectives. It's going to actually probably help it for many, many cases. So that's just what I would say more broadly.
Can I add to that also?
Of course.
So as teachers, we've realized and seen that there's still a lot of room to encourage Indigenous language and the culturally relevant approaches. But from personal experience, I've seen where there's people always ask about, there's a question on quality, the notion that, if we teach in the local language, this may affect the quality of what we expect our students to learn. So how, this is I guess an answer within a question. How would teachers address that? Because there's that notion, people asking, shouldn't this affect the quality of what we teach and how we teach? Because for me personally, I always encourage the culturally relevant approaches in my classroom, but then there are other teachers who also question that. They've probably been pressured by the administration or, somewhere higher up where there's that notion. And I don't know if teachers also experience that.
That's where I think it's good to be able to point to examples like our Navahi immersion school on the Big Island in Hawaii, which has an extremely high rate of admission to college after 12 years of schooling in Hawaiian with Hawaiian-based curricula as well, or other research that was in this presentation that looks at outcomes on standardized exams for students in dual immersion, Spanish, English, etc. programs who do better than the kids who are English only. So, those kinds of things are good, ammunition to have, or good responses at least to those concerns. But I think it's not easy. It requires continuous dialogue and illustration that this also can work.
You're right. Thank you.
And I think this also just ties back to the equity concern, just bringing up Kendi's last point here, that when we are able to not only know our students, build those relationships with them, leverage their knowledge, value their knowledge, then whatever we define as success is the way that we can support them and moving forward. And so, as Christina just mentioned, there's research that shows a variety of academic outcomes and other outcomes that show that when you leverage that bilingual knowledge, when you leverage even cultural knowledge too, you do support students in being successful in their lives. And I think this is a great time for us to wrap up. Again, I don't think many people dropped off after this, after we reached our time limit. So I appreciate everybody for being on the session and continuing this conversation, both unmuting yourselves and conversing, and then also the chat. There are a lot of resources out here, which we will compile and share out along with the slides and the recording when it becomes available. So on behalf of my colleagues here at REL Pacific, but of course to Christina and Delina, thank you all so much. Please feel free to reach out to any of us for further information, resources. We're happy to share. So thank you all so much. Mahalo, kalangan, and have a good night.